car crashes, defective products, dangerous drugs, injuries, and abuse. Across the state of Alabama, the attorneys, proudly sponsored by the law firm of Hollis Wright, are here to serve you. Your tough legal questions answered by our experts with the attorneys of Hollis Wright.
And welcome to the attorneys. I'm Art Franklin. Looking forward to have you with us for this next half hour as we talk about entrepreneurship and, get this, Corporate Transparency Act. You want to know what that's all about? We're going to talk about it. Attorneys at Hollis Wright, they're standing by right now to take your call. Wanted to tell you right up front, that number is 1-844-LAW-TALK. This is your time to call them for a free confidential call. You don't have to give your name, and they'll talk to you right now. We're going to be talking right now with our special guest that is lined up to talk about this deal with Entrepreneurship and Corporate Transparency Act as we go over to our managing partner from Hollis Wright, Josh.
Hope you had a good week.
I had a great week. Looking forward to this topic.
Absolutely. You know, and this is, we don't shy away from different topics, both on the business side and the individual victim side. This is more of a business side kind of show, but there are a lot of people that watch the show that are in the viewing audience area that run their own businesses. Right. And some may run mom and pop solo practitioners. Some may have corporate entities and PCs and incorporated entities and corporations. And this show is for them to make sure they don't make a mistake. What caught my eye, and we're going to be talking with Tripp Watson today, what caught my eye in just preparation for this is the government will fine you as much as $529 per day if you do not do this and you're required to do it. Yep. And so let's, first of all, welcome, and we're glad to have you on. How did you get into this area, Corporate Transparency Act litigation and kind of law? How did you get into this area? And then I want to unwrap kind of for the viewing audience what it is.
Yeah, so my family has always been entrepreneurs. I'm a first generation attorney, and so when I started out, I was like, I want to help people that are like my family. And so that's how I got into entrepreneurship, and then we've been doing this I've been doing it for 14 years now. But the Corporate Transparency Act is new. It just went into effect at the beginning of this year, and so we're trying to raise awareness about it because a lot of people, even though they're attorneys, don't know about the act or that they might be subject to it and might end up getting fines the beginning of next year. So,
all right, so unwrap it for us. In layman terms, what is the CTA? Who does it apply to? And just kind of let's talk through that.
All right. So a lot of people's eyes glaze over whenever they hear Corporate Transparency Act. And the problem with that is that it's a big act. It's probably one of the biggest acts that we've seen in a couple of generations. And it applies to anybody that has any filed legal entity, like an LLC, a corporation, a limited partnership, anybody that has even the most basic company, it applies to you. And unlike a lot of other federal laws that kick in when you have so many employees or whatnot, Corporate Transparency Act doesn't work that way. The Corporate Transparency Act kicks in immediately. And so if you set up an LLC to buy a rental house or to set up an Etsy store or something like that, you have to comply. And if you don't, the fines are significant. Okay. You've got to disclose this stuff within certain time periods. Otherwise, the fines are as much as $529 a day, up to $10,000 per violation. So it's a felony to not comply with this. And I mean, frankly, it scares me because a lot of people don't even know that the act exists.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. Like, let's give some context to this too. Like, what is the rationale for why these filings are required? Like, talk a little bit. I think it will help Art and I too understand. You know, what is this entity and what are they trying to protect? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the act came about because if you're getting a bank account or something like that or getting a loan, your bank's already having to collect this information and submit it to FinCEN. That's happening in the background. You don't really know that it's happening. But now they're pushing it more to the forefront where the individual LLC owners and corporation owners are having to push this information. And it's ultimately a counterterrorism act. They're trying to prevent money laundering and people moving money around. But the problem is that they just really haven't done a good job of raising awareness for a lot of folks. And so a lot of folks don't know that one, why the act exists, and two, what they have to do in order to comply with it. And so that's what it's designed to do. It's to get down to who's the underlying owner, the beneficial owners of these companies, so that we're not funneling money in a funny way.
And I think that's where you just hit the nail on the head for me, the awareness part of it, because nobody's getting the information out. I've never seen, I have an LLC, and I've not heard anything about the fact that, about CTAs and what information I need to disclose in order that I am, complying with what's needed.
So it's administered by a federal bureaucracy called FinCEN, the Financial Crimes and Information Network. And so FinCEN is this relatively small federal bureaucracy in D.C. It has something like 350 federal agents. But part of the legislation in the Corporate Transparency Act was to raise awareness for this act, and FinCEN was tasked with doing that. And they've tried to, but it's just a really small agency. As sweeping as the act is, though, I do think that there's a lot more. And so part of my job is getting the awareness out that a lot of people, they're like, oh yeah, well, I don't need to comply with the Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA, or the Fair Standards Labors Act, FLSA. So this probably doesn't apply to you. No, it does. It's actually the opposite. If you get to be a certain size, it doesn't apply to you anymore.
And this raises a great point. You mentioned you have an LLC. Think about this. There are people out there, and we all know examples of this, where you may have an individual that has 7, 8, 9 different LLCs that are operating different things that are helping them build wealth, if you will. And so those LLCs, for example, those incorporated entities, does it apply to all of them?
Each and every one of them. So probably one of our most complicated clients has 42 LLCs.
Yeah.
Dozens of LLCs. Those LLCs are owned by different people throughout different LLCs. Yeah. Every single one of those LLCs has to report. That's a separate filing. Now here's the kicker. The initial filings are pretty easy. You just submit your name, your a photo ID or something to that effect, driver's license number. It's pretty easy, and I think a lot of people will end up complying with that. Where it's going to catch a lot of people is any time that any of the information that you submitted changes, you have 30 days to file an amendment. So you get married and change your name, you move, the LLC no longer owns any part of the business, or maybe you have a partner that now owns more than the threshold amount. All of those need to be reported within a month. And if you're getting married, that's probably going to be the last thing that you're worried about is updating it for the 2 LLCs that you have for your rental house. So I think it's going to be a problem on the compliance end.
So I know we're getting ready to go to break here. Art, this is eye-opening for anybody that has set up a physical entity through the Secretary of State's office here in Alabama as an example. But what I want to do when we come back is talk about how you do the filings, kind of deadlines of those filings, and also really important, what to do to protect yourself, meaning can you go do this online, or do you need to go to a lawyer like Tripp to have that all handled? Let's talk about that when we come back, because I think it will be helpful for the viewing audience.
So remember these 3 letters, CTA. We thought it was going to be boring. Absolutely not. So many people have companies out there, LLCs, need to know this information. Tripp said it went into effect this year. So we want to give you the information that you need to keep you on track of doing everything within the right laws. Now, also want to remind you, there's a QR code on the bottom of the screen, just to the right. You'll see it right there. Go ahead and scan that QR code, and you can get to an attorney at Hollis Wright. You can ask a question. You can call 1-844-LAW-TALK. Someone is standing by. Yes, the phones are ringing. They'll take your call right now for a free and confidential call. You can reach Hollis Wright. We've got a lot to talk about, CTAs and more, when we come back from break.
I'm Josh Wright with the law firm of Hollis Wright, a personal injury law firm, and thank you for watching The Attorneys. We hope you, a friend, or a loved one never needs legal counsel for a case. But if you do, the goal of the show is simple: to provide answers and legal counsel when you need it the most. Your call to the show is free and off air. So if you have questions specific to the show or related to other accident or injury topics, call, email, or text us. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, or go to hollis-wright.com and click on the Contact Us button. We know your time is valuable, so thank you for spending it with us and watching The Attorneys.
The Attorneys, proudly sponsored by the law firm of Hollis Wright, are here to serve you.
When we started the show in 2011, my goal was to do what our firm does best. Help people answer questions related to real-world legal issues they have in their lives in a way that's not intimidating to talk with a lawyer. If the issue is important to you, it's equally important to us, and we're ready to talk with you at no cost.
Yeah, oftentimes people are confronting various legal issues in their lives that really run the gamut of a lot of different legal practice areas, such as bankruptcy, criminal law, civil law, such as personal injury, divorces, domestic relations. And to be able to have a show once a week that covers those practice areas and answers people's questions in those areas, that's really the main objective of the show.
We use the resources of the many lawyers at our law firm to create a plan that has a lasting impact for each person that calls or texts. And we also give back to the community at the same time. We are here to serve you, the viewer, each week on The Attorneys.
You see us each Sunday night on The Attorneys, but remember, our attorneys are here all week long to help you with your personal injury claim.
Our attorneys are standing by right now to give you a free consultation at Hollis Wright. Your result matters.
Welcome back to The Attorneys. You may have noticed some information on your screen. We like to share information about the topic that we are sharing with you on the show, so you'll get additional information there. So make sure you check that out as well. And if you need to speak to an attorney, we give you that number again. It's 1-844-LAW-TALK. Someone from Hollis Wright standing by. The phones are ringing. They'll take your call. It's a free and confidential call. We want to get right back into this, Josh, with Tripp on this corporate tax, CTA.
Yeah, remember this name, Tripp
Yes.
Watson,
Yes.
because it's going to be super important over the next year for all of us. All right, so let's talk about some of the very specific issues, and I may rapid fire you a little bit. First,
Bring it on.
When does this come into being? When does it require you to comply, and kind of what is the deadline for that?
Now.
Okay.
So it went into effect January 1st of this year, 2024. So it is already in effect. It was passed back in 2021, so it's been kicked down the road a couple of times, but it is in effect now. Good news is penalties don't get assessed until 2025.
Okay.
So you've got the rest of the year to get set up, but the full guns are blazing starting January 1st of next year.
Let me see if I can put this into simple layman terms as I'm processing it. If you have an entity that you have set up and you have less than 20 employees, and I know you told me that off air, but it's 20 employees as the threshold. You have less than 20 employees. You have an obligation to either go to the federal website or hire someone to assist you in this process, depending on how many of these entities you have and need help, in order to register certain information related to ownership, correct? All right.
Correct.
Now, when we talk about the 20 employee threshold, I'm assuming is that permanent employees?
So that gets into all the detail work. So the form itself, when you go to FinCEN's website, the form's pretty easy. But Josh, as you know, as lawyers, filling out the form is often easy if you know what to put in the form.
Yeah.
The question is which form do I need? How do I fill it out? What information do I need to actually upload into the form? And so that's a lot of the issue. And so for a lot of these folks, you're going to file, the filing takes 5 minutes if you know what you're doing.
Right.
But if you don't know what you're doing, it can create a lot of complications. So if you have several different owners, that can all complicate the things. So yes, if you are any LLC, any corporation, and you have an ownership interest that is more than 20%, you're going to have to file beneficial ownership reports. And those have to be filed with FinCEN. There's 23 exceptions, but the one that's going to apply for most businesses is going to be the large company exemption.
Okay.
And that kicks in at 20 employees and $5 million in gross revenues over the last 2 years.
Okay.
And that's full-time equivalents, because you had asked about what that was.
Yeah.
And so you're going to hit that, but if you dip below that, you lose the exemption.
So then you'd have to file. Like, let's assume someone has 7 or 8 different entities that they've set up because they do marketing on the side, they run a restaurant, they're running a law firm, whatever.
Well, they have a holding company that owns those companies.
And so one of those entities has more than 20 employees and does more than $5 million of gross revenue over the last 2 years, but several of them do not. You've got to register the ones that don't, correct?
Correct. So this is where things get complex. Again, the form's easy to fill out. It's knowing what to put in the form. And so if you've got a number of different companies, number of different LLCs, you've got to assess each one of them whether or not they meet the exemptions. And so, in a situation like that, you might have 8 LLCs and only one qualifies for an exemption, which means for the other 7, I still got to file those reports. And I have to file those reports for everybody that owns those businesses. So that means if you have a business with your spouse and y'all are 50-50, both of y'all are having to submit that information.
It's the other thing about it is just knowing that you have to do that. One thing I want to ask you are, what do you think are some of the challenges that are going to be faced with all the businesses and people who have the LLCs? What are the challenges?
First challenge is awareness. Is knowing that you've got to comply with this act. Everybody kind of knows now that you got to file income taxes. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows, especially if you have employees, that you got to withhold payroll taxes. Mm-hmm. We're used to that now. We're now having to get used to this. This is a new process. And so getting that awareness is going to be the next big thing. 2 is going to be staying on top of it. You have to file your taxes by April 15th every year. The deadlines on this are different. It's whenever the information changes. It's 30 days. And so it's not the same schedules that you have with the other disclosures that you have with the IRS, State Department of Revenue, anything else like that. So the timelines are going to be different. So staying on top of it is going to be really difficult.
Are you filing on behalf of the entity, or are you filing on behalf of yourself to the extent you own more than 20% of an entity? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
And yes.
Okay, so both.
So the responsibility falls on the reporting company.
Okay.
But companies can't do anything without somebody submitting that information. And so that's part of the detail. The owners are still responsible for reporting that information to the company, and then the company's supposed to report that.
Gotcha. So what is a recommendation from Tripp on if someone owns 6, 7 entities? Do they come to someone like you and say, look, I would like you to make sure I'm in compliance? And each time, no different than I deal with my accountant every year, right? And our firm deals with the accountant. And we have certain deadlines, and we know what those deadlines are. When things change, whether it's a name change, an address change, whatever, a state license change, you move to Mississippi, et cetera, they just come to you and say, hey, look, the following has changed. Please submit my updates. Is that?
Yep. Okay. So a lot of times what we're doing is we're gathering the information necessary in order to submit that off. We strongly recommend that you work with a professional in order to get all this detail worked out. Because again, the penalties for noncompliance are massive. It's much worse than not filing your income taxes. And so in that context, it's a lot cheaper to hire a professional to look over everything, make sure everything's submitted, instead of getting a letter from FinCEN that you've not been in compliance for 30 days, and now you're looking at thousands of dollars of costs.
But so many mom and pop companies just may not have the money to even hire an attorney to do that.
And unfortunately, that's part of it. And so, yes, the information that they're asking, I think part of the reason that FinCEN did the forms that they did, and this is my personal opinion, I think that they intentionally made it as lowest barrier to entry as possible to make it understandable, so I know what information you need for me to complete the form myself. So I do think that there will be some people that grasp the concept enough to be able to submit the information themselves. However, I would hate to have that recommendation and then somebody mess something up. They fail to disclose somebody that owns 30% of the company. And it gets complicated because it's not just ownership, but it's control. And so if somebody has a 30% vote, but they don't have 30% ownership, they still have to be disclosed. Really? So it gets real complex about who needs to be disclosed. And so you're going to have a lot of people that get disclosed even though they don't really have a majority position inside the business or really even an ownership interest.
Yeah.
So,
So I know we're getting ready to go to break. I want to leave the viewing audience before we go to our last commercial break with this. It sounds, and I've been processing this throughout the show, it sounds like, wow, this is just extra bureaucracy. Why does the U.S. government require us to do this? It seems like overkill. But when I researched it to get prepared for this show, one of the most important things they're doing, and Tripp talked about it, which is counteract terrorism, and counteract money laundering. It is to also protect our financial system and the U.S. dollar, which is not done in many other countries. So part of protecting the financial system requires some extra hurdles. It's an interesting play back and forth here between bureaucracy and the need to protect the financial system, but I kind of get it. Yeah. So I know we're getting ready to go to commercial break. When we come back, I do want to talk about penalties because he's mentioned that several times. These penalties are significant. They'll make you get concerned.
And you've helped us get it too, both of you guys, because this is real serious stuff. Not a topic that you want to glaze over. This is very important for all of you who own businesses out there. You've got an LLC. This is important stuff. And that's why Hollis Wright does this, to give you the information that you need. So go ahead and follow Hollis Wright on all social media platforms, on X, formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You can get really good information there. And those numbers at the bottom of the screen, those numbers are there for a reason. You can text to Hollis Wright, and you can find out information there, ask your questions there as well. We're going to take a break. We still have a little bit more time so we can get more into these CTAs. Important stuff, guys. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Thank you for watching The Attorneys each Sunday night, where we come to your living room to provide free legal advice in a confidential, off-air setting. Unfortunately, with the number of calls, texts, and emails that come in during the show, we can't always get to everything. But know this, Hollis Wright is open all week long. You call us at 844-LAW-TALK and we're going to answer your question for free. Thank you for watching The Attorneys, and we look forward to seeing you and talking to you soon.
Did you know when you have to take a case all the way to trial, there is almost always insurance involved? Don't take on large insurance companies on your own. Our attorneys are standing by right now to give you a free consultation. At Hollis Wright, your result matters.
And welcome back to The Attorneys. We also want to give you that last chance in this half hour to reach an attorney, because while we're on, the attorneys are standing by to take your call. That number is 1-844-LAW-TALK. That call is free. It's confidential, but we are talking about Corporate Transparency Act, something I just learned about, but this is so important for so many people.
Well, I mean, I'm assuming you're kind of thinking the same thing I am, which is this has been eye-opening.
Yes,
Before
indeed.
This show started, I didn't recognize I had these obligations. It makes a lot more sense now. Tripp, talk just a little bit about how the penalties work and what you recommend about someone coming to a guy like you and your law firm to be able to do this that has multiple LLCs, and how you structure those deals.
Yeah. So first and foremost, the penalties are really the headline on this act. Is, like I said, the compliance is relatively easy. It's going to cost you a few $100s, maybe even less, for most businesses to comply with the act. It's pretty easy to comply with. That is an additional expense, but you got to consider what the potential penalties are. And again, I said, they're not messing around. It's $529 a day. Started out at $500. They bumped it up $29. That caps out at $10,000. You can spend as much as 2 years in jail for a willful violation of this act. And so what that means is that you're looking at a potential felony for not complying with the act. So when you're looking at it, what's my risk? What's my cost of compliance? spend a couple $100 just to make sure I'm good and that everything has been submitted the way that I'm supposed to is pretty easy to do. And that's the way that we're structuring it. We're doing assessments, we're looking at them, we're saying, how many of these do you have to file, who needs to file, what information needs to be collected, and getting all that submitted off the same way that your accountant gets your taxes submitted, or if you had an attorney help set up your LLC, making sure that your federal tax ID number got set up. All of that information is collected as a matter of course, but we know the questions to ask. And if you knew the questions to ask yourself, you could probably fill out the form yourself, but do you want to take the risk that you missed something? And that's the problem.
One of the questions I was going to ask too is, I know that there will be people thinking, well, I'll just talk with my accountant to handle this for me. The reality is that may not be as simple as they think.
Correct. So a lot of accountants, from a professional standpoint, are not going to be allowed to do this. There's been several accountancy malpractice carriers that have said that they're not going to cover opinions for accountants on the Corporate Transparency Act. It's a legal decision. It's not an accounting decision. So your accountant is probably not going to be able to help you out, and they're probably going to refer you to an attorney to get set up.
I'm just wondering how it's going to change the whole business landscape.
It's going to be interesting. Actually, there's been a lawsuit filed in Northern District of Alabama that has determined that it was unconstitutional. That's a very, very limited application. And so that's up on appeal. That'll go to the 11th Circuit. And so that's going to take some time before that gets shaken out. But yeah, coming next year, you're going to see a very, very different compliance landscape that's going to fall disproportionately on small businesses.
Think about this too. School systems that have registered entities, 501c3 entities that raise money for high school sports. These are all, set up entities that in theory have obligations to consider whether or not that they apply or not. It'll be very interesting to see how this all develops.
Yeah, and so that's actually one of the exemptions is nonprofit entities, because a lot of this information, if you've ever done a 501c3, a lot of this information is getting submitted to the IRS anyway, who the ownerships are, whatnot. And so it wouldn't apply if you've applied for a tax exemption.
Okay.
Now, if you run a small, fund locally and y'all don't really file any taxes for it, it would still technically capture that.
And you mentioned there are 23. I don't know if that was hyperbole or
no,
accurate.
It's exactly how many.
So, that's another reason why someone comes to TRIP and says, hey, do we have to comply? It sounds like there are some exemptions that can be used, not just 20 employees with a certain amount of gross revenue, but tax-exempt entities, et cetera. So maybe worth just making a phone call and trying to find out.
Yeah, and that's not exaggeration. There's 23 exemptions, and so figuring out which Plinko slot you wind up in is important.
Last issue I've got is, do you think that there's a potential that the deadline gets pushed? It's been pushed several years. Or do you think right now the deadline, people just need to recognize it's a January 1, 2025 deadline?
Yeah, and this is my personal opinion, take it for a grain of salt. I think the 11th Circuit is going to be very friendly to this lawsuit that's coming in. I think that there's also, when you're going to start seeing penalties come in, starting in February of 2025, I think you're going to see a lot of angry people that are calling their congresspeople to figure out what's going on.
Okay.
So I would be shocked if it sticks around in its current form for a long time. But if you do have concerns about it, the best way to protest is to comply with it, but contact your legislator. Don't do it.
Trip, thank you. Great stuff. Great stuff.
Also, thank you for joining us on The Attorneys. We'll see you back here next week, same time, same place.
Thanks for watching The Attorneys, sponsored by Hollis Wright.